Teen bullies cornered an elderly black man in the park. He was a former boxing champion. Why did the teenagers believe the elderly man would be an easy target? What would happen when they discovered the life and strength hidden behind his quiet appearance? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Afterglow Reckoning Tales, where dangerous assumptions, unexpected courage, and powerful lessons unfold before your eyes. Before today's story begins, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable episode. Thank you for watching, commenting, sharing, and continuing to support our growing channel. Every bit of encouragement helps Afterglow Reckoning Tales reach more viewers around the world. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there right now. We are always grateful to hear from our global audience. Now, get comfortable, watch every movement closely, and let us step into the beginning of today's remarkable story. Get up, old man. This park isn't for people who can't defend themselves. The words didn't sound like a joke. They landed like a challenge. On a quiet Saturday afternoon in Lincoln Park, Chicago, the laughter of teenagers cut through the peaceful sound of birds, footsteps, and the wind moving through the trees. At the center of it stood a man most people would have ignored. His name was Elias Thompson. 72 years old. A faded black jacket. Old sneakers. A small paper bag of bread crumbs in his hand as he sat alone on a wooden bench, feeding the birds and watching the world move around him. To anyone passing by, Elias looked like just another elderly man enjoying a quiet afternoon. But to Dylan Carter and his friends, he looked like someone easy to target. Someone who wouldn't fight back. Dylan, 17 years old, stepped closer with a smirk on his face. His friends Jake and Tyler stood behind him, laughing quietly, phones already in their hands. "Are you even listening?" Dylan said. "We're talking to you." Elias slowly looked up. His eyes were calm. Not angry. Not afraid. Just tired. "I heard you," Elias replied. His voice was low and steady. That somehow made Dylan more uncomfortable. Most people yelled back. Most people got defensive. Most people gave him the reaction he wanted. But Elias gave him nothing. Dylan looked at his friends and laughed. "See that? He thinks he's better than us." Jake chuckled. "Maybe he forgot where he is." The teenagers moved closer, surrounding the bench. A circle formed. Not just around Elias. Around the idea that an older man sitting quietly could somehow deserve less respect. Elias looked around the park. A few people noticed what was happening. A woman walking her dog slowed down. A father pushing a stroller glanced over. A man sitting near the fountain looked uncomfortable. But nobody moved. Nobody wanted to get involved. Elias had seen that silence before. Not in a park. Not from teenagers. But in moments when people decided someone was less important because of how they looked, where they came from, or what they assumed they knew. Dylan reached down and picked up Elias's old boxing cap from beside him. He turned it around in his hand. "Boxing?" Dylan laughed. "You?" Elias looked at the cap. For a brief moment, something changed in his expression. Not anger. A memory. A lifetime hidden behind tired eyes. But it disappeared quickly. "That belonged to me," Elias said. Dylan smiled. "Then take it." The teenagers laughed. Elias slowly stood. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just enough to show that the man sitting on that bench was not as fragile as they thought. The entire park seemed to become quieter. Dylan noticed it too. For the first time, his smile faded slightly. Because there was something strange about Elias Thompson. The way he stood. The way he carried himself. The way he looked at them like he had already seen this moment before. "You know," Elias said softly, there was a time when people knew my name. Dylan rolled his eyes. Yeah? And now? Elias looked at him. Now I'm just hoping people remember respect. Dylan laughed again, louder this time. But he didn't know something. He didn't know the man standing in front of him was not just an old man. He didn't know that decades earlier, thousands of people had shouted his name inside packed arenas. He didn't know that those same hands he was mocking once carried championship belts. He didn't know that before Elias Thompson became the quiet man sitting in a park, he was a fighter who had survived battles most people could never imagine. And in just a few minutes, everyone in that park would learn one truth: they had mistaken silence for weakness. And they were about to discover who they had really cornered. You really think an old man like me has nothing left to prove? Elias Thompson's words were quiet. But the confidence behind them carried something the teenagers couldn't understand. Because some people lose their power when they get older. And some people simply learn how to hide it. For years, Elias had lived a life far away from the spotlight. No cameras. No interviews. No crowds chanting his name. Just quiet mornings, long walks, and afternoons spent sitting on the same wooden bench in Lincoln Park. To everyone around him, he was simply Elias. An elderly man who kept to himself. But decades earlier, that same man had been one of the most feared fighters in America. Before the gray hair. Before the slow steps. Before the world forgot his name. There was a time when Elias Thompson walked into a boxing ring and made entire arenas stand still. At 29 years old, he wasn't the biggest fighter. He wasn't the loudest. He wasn't the one who promised to destroy his opponents during press conferences. He was something much more dangerous. Disciplined. Focused. Unshaken. His opponents learned quickly that Elias didn't fight with anger. He fought with patience. Every movement had a purpose. Every punch had a reason. And every victory came from years of sacrifice that nobody saw. But fame was never the thing Elias wanted. After winning championships and becoming a symbol of determination for young athletes across the country, he slowly stepped away. People wondered why. Some thought he was afraid of losing. Others thought he had nothing left to give. They were wrong. The truth was much simpler. Elias had already fought enough battles. Not every fight needed a winner. Not every enemy needed to be defeated. Sometimes, walking away was the strongest choice a person could make. But that afternoon in the park, standing in front of Dylan Carter and his friends, Elias felt something familiar. Not fear. Not anger. A reminder. A reminder of all the times people looked at him and decided they already knew his story. Dylan still held Elias's old boxing cap in his hand. "You're really expecting us to believe you were some kind of fighter?" he mocked. His friends laughed. "You look like you can barely walk." The words hit harder than they realized. Not because Elias believed them. But because he knew those words came from the same place many others had spoken from before. Judgment. Assumption. The belief that appearance told the whole story. Elias looked at Dylan carefully. He didn't see a villain. He saw a young man who had never been taught the difference between confidence and cruelty. "Young man," Elias said, "strength isn't about making someone smaller so you can feel bigger." Dylan rolled his eyes. "Here we go. Old people giving speeches." He stepped closer. The phone in Jake's hand continued recording. They wanted a reaction. They wanted a moment they could laugh about later. But Elias gave them nothing. And that bothered Dylan more than any insult could have. Because Elias wasn't acting like someone trapped. He was acting like someone waiting. Across the park, a man sitting near the walking path suddenly stopped moving. His name was Marcus Reed. A local boxing coach who had spent 20 years training young fighters. At first, he only glanced over. Then he looked again. And this time, his expression changed. The way Elias stood. The calm in his eyes. The old boxing cap. It couldn't be. Marcus slowly stood up. He stared at the elderly man surrounded by teenagers. Then he whispered something that nobody around him heard. No way, because Marcus wasn't looking at an old man anymore. He was looking at a legend. And in that moment, the park was about to discover a truth Dylan Carter never expected. The man they were laughing at wasn't someone who had lost his strength. He was someone who had spent a lifetime mastering it. You have no idea who you're standing in front of. Marcus Reed whispered those words to himself as he stared across Lincoln Park. Because he knew. He knew before anyone else. The teenagers saw an old man sitting alone on a bench. Marcus saw a legend. A man who had once made entire arenas hold their breath. A man whose name had disappeared from headlines but never from the memories of those who truly understood boxing. Elias Thompson. The name hit Marcus like a bell from the past. 25 years earlier, Marcus was just a young kid watching boxing matches with his father in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago. His father had always told him one thing: pay attention to fighters who don't need to talk. And every time Elias Thompson entered the ring, the world became quiet. Because Elias was different. He didn't dance around for cameras. He didn't insult opponents during interviews. He didn't need to convince anyone that he was dangerous. His discipline spoke before he did. His record spoke before he did. And his victories spoke louder than any words ever could. But standing in the park that afternoon, nobody saw the champion. Nobody saw the years of training. Nobody saw the sacrifices. They only saw an elderly black man surrounded by teenagers who believed they had power because they had an audience. Dylan Carter still held Elias's boxing cap. He tossed it from one hand to the other. So what's the story? Dylan asked with a grin. You were some big fighter when you were young? Elias looked at the cap. For a second, the noise of the park disappeared. He remembered the bright lights. The smell of the boxing ring. The sound of thousands of people screaming his name. He remembered walking into arenas where opponents twice his size tried to intimidate him. And he remembered walking out every single time. But Elias also remembered something else. The reason he left. The final match of his career. The night he realized the greatest victory wasn't always the one announced by a referee. Sometimes the greatest victory was knowing when to stop fighting. Elias looked back at Dylan. Yes, he said simply. Dylan laughed. Wait, you're actually saying yes? Elias nodded. I was a fighter. Jake and Tyler looked at each other. Then they laughed harder. A fighter? Jake repeated. You can barely stand. The words traveled through the air. A few people nearby looked away. Others watched silently. But Marcus Reed couldn't stay still anymore. He started walking toward them. Slowly. Carefully. Because he wasn't just approaching a stranger. He was approaching someone who had inspired his entire life. Dylan, Marcus said. The teenager turned around. What? Marcus looked at Elias. Then back at the boys. Do you know who that is? Dylan shrugged. Some old guy. Marcus shook his head. No, his voice became serious. That's Elias Thompson. The laughter stopped. Not completely. But enough. Because the way Marcus said the name made everyone listen. Dylan looked confused. So? Marcus took out his phone. His fingers moved quickly. Searching. Finding. Then he turned the screen around. An old black and white photo appeared. A young Elias standing inside a boxing ring. Championship belt around his waist. Thousands of fans behind him. The same eyes. The same calm expression. The same man. Only younger. The park became quieter. Dylan stared at the picture. Then looked back at Elias. No way, Elias didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. Because the truth didn't need permission. Marcus stepped closer. Your grandfather probably knew that name, he said. Dylan's expression changed. For the first time that afternoon, confidence disappeared. Because the person he thought was powerless suddenly had a history bigger than anything he could understand. But Dylan wasn't ready to admit it yet. Not fully. Pride held him there. So he did what people often do when reality challenges their ego. He pushed back. So what? Dylan said. He was good back then. That doesn't mean anything now. Marcus looked at him. And Elias remained silent. Because the real lesson had not started yet. The boys had discovered who Elias Thompson was. But they still had no idea what kind of man he had become. And that was the part they would remember forever. You're telling me that old man was a champion? Dylan Carter's voice was different now. The confidence was still there. But something had changed. The laughter was gone. Because for the first time that afternoon, Dylan wasn't looking at Elias Thompson like an easy target. He was looking at him like a question. A question he didn't want answered. The park had become strangely quiet. A few moments earlier, the teenagers had surrounded Elias, believing they controlled the situation. Now they stood there, surrounded by a story much bigger than themselves. Marcus Reed held the phone in his hand, showing the old photograph of Elias inside the boxing ring. The image was faded. The colors were gone. But the power behind it remained. A young Elias Thompson stood under the bright arena lights, wearing a championship belt around his waist while thousands of people filled the background. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. He simply looked calm. The same calm expression he had on his face sitting on that park bench. Because greatness doesn't disappear with age. It only becomes quieter. Marcus looked at Dylan. His final championship fight was watched by millions of people. Dylan stared at the picture. That's impossible. Marcus shook his head. No. What's impossible is that you were standing 3 feet away from him and had no idea. The words hit harder than Dylan expected. Because suddenly, every insult from the last few minutes sounded different. The old man. The weak man. The person they thought didn't matter. Those weren't just insults anymore. They were proof of how quickly people judged someone they knew nothing about. Elias slowly reached for his cap. Marcus handed it back to him. Their eyes met. There was a silent understanding between them. Marcus respected Elias. Not because of the championships. Not because of the fame. But because he knew what Elias had chosen after becoming a legend. Humility. Most people spend their lives trying to become known. Elias had spent his life learning how to live peacefully after everyone already knew his name. Dylan looked uncomfortable. But instead of apologizing, he crossed his arms. So what? He said. The attitude returned. Maybe he was good 30 years ago. That doesn't change anything. Marcus looked disappointed. Because he recognized that response. The response of someone who wasn't ready to learn. Elias watched Dylan. Carefully. He saw more than arrogance. He saw insecurity. A young person trying to look powerful because deep down, he didn't understand real strength. You think winning fights made me a champion? Elias asked. Dylan didn't answer. Elias stepped closer. Not aggressively. Just enough to make him listen. Winning was easy compared to what came after. The wind moved through the trees. The park became silent again. Elias continued. The hardest part of life isn't proving you're strong. It's deciding what kind of person you want to become when nobody is watching. Those words stayed in the air. Even Dylan's friends stopped joking. Because this wasn't the moment they expected. They came looking for entertainment. They wanted embarrassment. They wanted a video they could share. But they found something else. A lesson. Marcus looked at Elias and remembered the stories people told about him. Not the stories about knockout punches. Not the stories about championship victories. The stories about what happened outside the ring. The times Elias visited struggling neighborhoods. The times he trained young athletes for free. The times he helped people who had nobody else to believe in them. Because that was the part of Elias Thompson's legacy that never appeared on a scoreboard. The trophies collected dust. The headlines faded. But the impact remained. Dylan looked down at the boxing cap in his hand. For the first time, he seemed to understand the weight of what he had done. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a moment that revealed something about who he was becoming. Elias noticed. But he didn't attack. He didn't embarrass him. He simply extended his hand. "Give me my cap." Dylan hesitated. Then slowly placed it in Elias's hand. A small action. But somehow, it felt bigger than any fight. Because everyone in that park was watching something they never expected to see. Not an old man defeating teenagers. Not a champion showing off his power. But a man with every reason to be angry choosing patience instead. And Dylan still didn't realize it yet. The biggest lesson of the day wasn't that Elias Thompson had once been a champion. It was that he never stopped being one. The greatest fight of my life was never inside that ring. Elias Thompson's voice was calm. Almost too calm for a moment like this. The teenagers expected anger. They expected a speech about disrespect. They expected the old man they had cornered to finally show them the strength they believed he had lost. But Elias did something they never expected. He told them the truth. Because the story of Elias Thompson was never just about boxing. It was about everything that happened after the lights faded. The championship belts. The newspaper headlines. The roaring crowds. Those moments belonged to the past. But the lesson stayed. As the people in the park watched, Elias sat back down on the bench. The same bench where the entire situation had started. The same place where a group of teenagers thought they had found someone powerless. Marcus Reed stood nearby, listening carefully. He had heard stories about Elias before. But he had never heard the man himself explain what happened behind the victories. "People think being a champion means you never fall," Elias said. But that's not true. His eyes moved toward the trees in the distance. A quiet memory appeared behind his expression. Every champion falls. The park became silent. Because suddenly, this wasn't about a boxing match. It was about life. Years ago, when Elias was at the highest point of his career, everyone saw the success. They saw the trophies. They saw the victories. They saw the powerful athletes standing under bright lights. But nobody saw the early mornings. Nobody saw the injuries. Nobody saw the doubts. Nobody saw the moments when Elias had to fight battles outside the ring. He remembered being a young man with a dream and very little support. He remembered walking into gyms where people underestimated him before he even threw his first punch. They looked at his size. They looked at his background. They looked at his skin. And they decided they already knew what he could become. But Elias learned something important. Other people's opinions could become a prison if you allowed them to. So he built something stronger. Discipline. Every day. Every training session. Every sacrifice. He didn't become a Champion because people believed in him. He became a champion because he believed in himself before anyone else did. Dylan listened quietly. The arrogance on his face had disappeared. Because for the first time, he wasn't hearing an old man give advice. He was hearing someone who had survived things he couldn't imagine. You know what the hardest part was? Elias asked. Dylan looked at him. Winning? Elias shook his head. No, he paused. Being respected after people decided they had already judged you. Those words carried weight. Marcus understood exactly what Elias meant. Because he knew this story was bigger than one afternoon in a park. It was about every person who had ever been ignored because someone only saw the outside. Every person who had been underestimated before they had the chance to speak. Elias looked at Dylan. You thought my age made me weak. Dylan lowered his eyes. You thought because I wasn't loud, I wasn't strong. The teenager said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. The truth was standing right in front of him. Elias continued. But strength isn't about proving you can hurt someone. It's about having the ability to hurt someone and choosing not to. The words hit harder than any punch ever could. Jake and Tyler looked uncomfortable. The video they recorded no longer felt funny. The moment they wanted to share as a joke had become something completely different. A lesson. A reminder. A story they would never forget. Marcus smiled slightly. Because this was the Elias Thompson he remembered. Not just the fighter. Not just the champion. The man. The man who understood that every person carries a story nobody else can see. Dylan slowly looked at the boxing cap in Elias's hand. Then he looked back at the man wearing it. How did you stop fighting? Dylan asked quietly. Elias smiled faintly. I didn't. The teenager looked confused. Elias continued. I just learned that not every battle needs a punch. For the first time that afternoon, Dylan truly saw Elias. Not as an old man. Not as a former athlete. But as a person. And that was the moment the real lesson began. Because the greatest victory Elias Thompson ever earned wasn't a championship belt. It was becoming the kind of man who no longer needed one to prove his worth. Stand up. For the first time that afternoon, those words came from Elias Thompson. But they weren't spoken with anger. They weren't a challenge. They were an invitation. Dylan Carter looked confused. The entire day had been about one thing. Trying to prove who was stronger. The teenagers believed strength came from embarrassing someone. From making people afraid. From showing everyone that they had control. But Elias had spent his entire life learning something different. Real strength was not about making people step back. It was about having the courage to step forward. Slowly, Elias placed his old boxing cap on the bench. Then he stood. And the entire park seemed to notice. It was a simple movement. An elderly man standing up from a wooden bench. But somehow, it felt bigger than that. Because the way Elias moved was different. There was no struggle. No hesitation. No weakness. His back was straight. His shoulders were relaxed. His eyes were focused. The same eyes that once stared across a boxing ring at opponents who wanted to take everything from him. Dylan stopped smiling. Marcus Reed noticed immediately. He had seen fighters before. He had trained hundreds of athletes. But he knew something most people didn't. Champions carried themselves differently. Not because they wanted attention. Because they had already survived the moments that tested them. Elias looked at Dylan. Do you want to know why I stopped boxing? Dylan didn't answer. Nobody did. So Elias continued. Because I realized something. He looked around the park. At some point, everyone thinks the goal is to become powerful. A pause. But nobody teaches you what to do after you have power. The teenagers listened. Even Dylan. Elias slowly raised his hands. Not like someone preparing to attack. Like someone remembering. The position. The balance. The discipline. The movement was simple. A guard. A step. A controlled motion. But the reaction was immediate. People watching from across the park recognized it. Marcus smiled. Because he remembered. That stance. That patience. That control. This was the man who once stood across from champions. This was the man who never panicked. This was Elias Thompson. The fighter who understood that every movement had a purpose. Dylan watched closely. For the first time, he wasn't seeing an old man. He was seeing history. You thought I was weak because I didn't react, Elias said. But patience is not weakness. He lowered his hands. Sometimes patience is the strongest thing a person can have. The words settled over the park. Dylan looked away. Because deep down, he knew something had changed. The person he wanted to embarrass had never been trying to compete with him. Elias had been trying to teach him. Marcus stepped closer. You know what made Elias different from everyone else? Dylan looked at him. It wasn't his punches. Marcus pointed toward Elias. It was his control. The crowd remained quiet. Because that was the part nobody expected. Everyone wanted a dramatic moment. They wanted Elias to prove himself with power. They wanted the old champion to show everyone what he could still do. But Elias did the opposite. He showed restraint. He showed wisdom. He showed that a true champion doesn't need to destroy someone to prove he can. Dylan looked at his friends. The same friends who had been laughing earlier. Now they stood silently. Their phones were still recording. But the video had changed. It was no longer a clip of an old man being mocked. It was a moment of realization. A moment where arrogance met experience. An experience won without throwing a single punch. Elias picked up his cap. Before putting it back on, he looked at Dylan one more time. When you're young, you think respect comes from making people fear you. Dylan listened. But when you grow older, you learn something. Elias placed the cap on his head. Respect comes from how you treat people who cannot give you anything in return. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then Dylan quietly asked, "Were you really a champion?" Elias looked at Marcus. Then back at Dylan. A small smile appeared on his face. "Yes. But the championship belt was never the thing that made me one." And that answer stayed with everyone. Because in that moment, the park didn't witness an old boxer proving he still had power. They witnessed something much rarer. A true champion showing that the greatest strength is knowing when not to fight. Do you know what they called him? Marcus Reed's question was directed at Dylan. But everyone in the park heard it. The teenager looked confused. He had expected a lecture. He had expected embarrassment. He had expected Elias Thompson to walk away quietly after everything that happened. But he never expected the story behind the man. Marcus looked at the old photograph on his phone again. The image showed a younger Elias standing in the center of a boxing ring. Thousands of people surrounded him. A championship belt rested across his shoulder. The crowd behind him was a blur of excitement. But Elias's face remained the same. Calm. Focused. Unshaken. The same expression he carried while standing in the park surrounded by teenagers who had underestimated him. Before you ever knew him as the man sitting on this bench, Marcus said, people knew him as something else. He looked at Dylan. They called him the Silent Storm. The name created a strange feeling in the air. Because suddenly, Elias wasn't just a retired boxer. He was a person with a history. A person who had already lived through battles most people could never imagine. Dylan looked at Elias. "You were really that famous?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the walking path. Children were riding bicycles. Families were enjoying the afternoon. The park was peaceful again. And maybe that was why he had chosen this place. Not for attention. Not for recognition. Just peace. "I was known," Elias finally said. Marcus smiled. "That's an understatement." He turned to the teenagers. "Do you understand what you just did?" Dylan looked away. Marcus continued. "You saw an older black man sitting alone, and you decided you knew his story." The words were not angry. They were honest. You decided his clothes told you who he was. You decided his age told you what he could do. You decided his silence meant he had nothing to say. The teenagers became quiet. Because every word described exactly what happened. They had not seen Elias. They had seen their own assumptions. And that was the mistake. Elias listened without interrupting. Because he understood something Marcus was trying to teach. The problem was never just one moment. It was the habit of judging people before knowing them. Elias had experienced that his entire life. When he was young, people doubted him before he ever entered the ring. They saw a black fighter trying to rise in a sport where many believed they already knew what someone like him could achieve. They underestimated his discipline. They underestimated his intelligence. They underestimated his heart. But every time someone decided he couldn't succeed, Elias answered the same way. Not with anger. With excellence. Marcus looked back at Dylan. "Do you know how many people Elias helped after he retired?" Dylan shook his head. "No, thousands." Marcus explained how Elias spent years training young athletes. Not just teaching them how to throw punches. Teaching them responsibility. Respect. Control. Because Elias knew something many people never learned. A person's legacy was not measured by how many people feared them. It was measured by how many people became better because they knew them. Dylan looked down. The confidence that had filled him earlier was gone. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about the video. He wasn't thinking about his friends watching. He was thinking about the person standing in front of him. A man he had mocked without knowing anything about. Elias noticed the change. And instead of making Dylan feel smaller, he gave him a chance to grow. "Everyone makes mistakes," Elias said. Dylan slowly looked up. "But what matters is what you do after you realize you were wrong." Those words were different. They weren't punishment. They were guidance. The kind of guidance Elias wished more people had received when they were younger. Marcus watched the moment carefully. Because he knew this was the real victory. Not revealing the championship. Not proving Elias was still capable. The real victory was watching someone finally understand. The afternoon began with teenagers surrounding an old man. But now, the entire park was witnessing something completely different. A former champion was teaching the next generation what strength truly meant. And Dylan Carter was about to learn the lesson that would stay with him far longer than any video he recorded that day. Because the greatest thing about Elias Thompson was never how hard he could hit. It was how much power he had, and how carefully he chose to use it. "I thought you were going to hit me." Those were the first words Dylan Carter said that sounded completely honest. No attitude. No confidence. No performance for his friends. Just a teenager finally admitting what he had expected from the beginning. He expected Elias Thompson to become angry. He expected the old man to lose control. Because that was what Dylan understood. He believed power was something you showed when someone challenged you. But Elias had spent decades learning something different. Power was not the ability to destroy. Power was the ability to choose. The afternoon sun began to move lower over Lincoln Park. The crowd that had gathered slowly started to understand what they had witnessed. This was never a story about a former boxing champion proving he could still fight. It was a story about a man who had already won the hardest battle of all. The battle against his own anger. Elias looked at Dylan. "I could have embarrassed you today." The teenager stayed quiet. "I could have shown everyone what I used to be." Elias looked at his hands. The same hands that once carried championship victories. The same hands that had thrown thousands of punches. But what would that have taught you? Dylan had no answer. Because he knew. Nothing. It would have only created another moment of humiliation. Another person trying to prove they were above someone else. And that was exactly how the cycle continued. Elias stood there, not as a fighter, but as a teacher. "You wanted to make me feel small," Elias said. Dylan lowered his eyes. "But you don't become bigger by making someone else smaller." The words stayed with him. Because they were simple. But they carried the weight of a lifetime. Marcus watched quietly. He knew this moment mattered. Years earlier, he had seen Elias win championships. He had seen crowds celebrate him. He had seen reporters call him unstoppable. But this moment felt different. This was a victory nobody would put on a scoreboard. A victory nobody would announce in an arena. But it might be the one that mattered most. Dylan looked toward his friends. Jake and Tyler stood silently. The excitement they had earlier was gone. They came to the park looking for entertainment. They wanted a story where someone else became the joke. But now they were the ones learning something. The person they laughed at had more strength than they could understand. Not because he could fight. Because he didn't need to. Dylan slowly stepped forward. He looked uncomfortable. Like apologizing was harder than anything he had done all day. "I'm sorry," he said. The words were quiet. Almost too quiet. But they were real. Elias nodded. Not because the apology erased everything. But because taking responsibility was the first step toward becoming better. "Thank you for saying that," Elias replied. Dylan looked surprised. He expected anger. He expected punishment. Instead, he received respect. And somehow, that made the lesson even stronger. Elias picked up his old boxing cap. Before putting it on, he looked at Dylan one more time. "You know, there was a time when people looked at me and saw only what they wanted to see." Dylan listened. "They saw my age. They saw where I came from. They saw things they thought limited me." A pause. But they never saw the work. The teenager understood. Because he had done the same thing. He saw an elderly black man. He created a story about him. And he never bothered to ask if that story was true. Elias placed the cap on his head. That's the mistake people make. They judge the chapter they see without knowing the chapters that came before. The park became quiet again. But this silence was different. Earlier, it was the silence of people watching something wrong happen. Now, it was the silence of people witnessing something meaningful. Marcus smiled. Because he knew Elias's greatest legacy was never the championship belt. It was moments like this. Moments where someone walked away changed. The video recorded that day would spread. People would talk about the retired champion who surprised everyone. They would talk about the teenagers who learned a lesson. But the most important part of the story would not be the reveal. It would not be the championship. It would not be the fame. It would be the choice Elias made when he had every reason to respond differently. He chose patience. He chose dignity. He chose compassion. And as Elias walked away from the bench where it all began, Everyone in that park understood one thing: a true champion is not defined by how many opponents they defeat. A true champion is defined by how many people they inspire to become better. Years later, people would remember the day in Lincoln Park. But they would not remember it because an old man defeated a group of teenagers. They would remember it because an old man changed them. Elias Thompson never wanted attention. That was the first thing people learned about him after that afternoon. He didn't give interviews. He didn't chase cameras. He didn't stand in front of crowds telling people about the championships he had won. Because Elias understood something most people spent their entire lives trying to discover. A person's worth was never measured by how many people knew their name. It was measured by what remained after they left. And for Elias, what remained was not the championship belts. It was not the photographs. It was not the cheers from thousands of fans inside crowded arenas. It was the people he helped. The lives he touched. The lessons he passed on. A few weeks after the incident at Lincoln Park, something unexpected happened. Dylan Carter returned. But this time, he wasn't holding a phone. He wasn't surrounded by friends. He wasn't looking for attention. He walked into a small community boxing gym on the south side of Chicago. The same gym where Marcus Reed trained young athletes. And standing near the ring was Elias. Dylan stopped at the entrance. For a moment, he looked like the same teenager from the park. Uncertain. Proud. Unsure how to admit he had changed. But then he remembered Elias's words. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what you do after you realize you were wrong. Dylan walked closer. I wanted to say thank you, he said. Elias looked at him. For what? For not being the person I thought you were. A small smile appeared on Elias's face. Most people don't get hurt by what others do. He paused. They get hurt by what others assume. Dylan nodded. Because he finally understood. The problem was never just what he did that day. The problem was how quickly he decided he knew someone without knowing their story. From that day forward, Dylan started training at the gym. Not because he wanted to become a champion. Not because he wanted people to fear him. But because he wanted to understand what Elias had been trying to teach. Discipline. Respect. Control. The things that built a real fighter long before they ever stepped into a ring. And every afternoon, Elias watched young athletes train. He corrected their stance. He taught them patience. He reminded them that the strongest person in the room was not always the loudest. Sometimes, it was the person who could remain calm when everyone else expected them to break. Marcus Reed often watched Elias from across the gym. And he always thought about that day in the park. The day when a group of teenagers believed they had cornered a powerless old man. They thought they found someone who couldn't fight back. But they were wrong. They had found someone who had already fought harder battles than they could imagine. Someone who had faced doubt. Someone who had faced disrespect. Someone who had spent a lifetime proving that greatness could not be taken away by someone else's judgment. Elias Thompson was once a boxing champion. But that was only one chapter of his story. The greater victory came years later. Not when he lifted a championship belt. Not when thousands celebrated his name. But when he stood in front of people who underestimated him, and chose to teach instead of destroy. Because anyone can throw a punch. Anyone can react with anger. But it takes true strength to show mercy when you have every reason not to. The world saw an elderly black man sitting alone on a park bench. They saw his age. They saw his quiet nature. They saw what they wanted to see. But they never saw the battles behind his eyes. They never saw the discipline behind his silence. They never saw the champion who was still there. And maybe that was the greatest lesson Elias Thompson ever gave. Never judge someone by the chapter you walked in on. Because the person you underestimate today may be the person whose story inspires you tomorrow. And that is why Elias Thompson was never just a former boxing champion. He was a champion long before the first bell rang. And he remained one long after the final round ended.